All right, will you check and confirm that people can hear? It's a multi-step process here. All right, I think you should be good to go now.
Okay. Hear me now? All right, so ecology, again, that's when it kind of came home to me, like, this is why I'm here. This is what I find interesting, and it's going to keep me in this profession. Other subdisciplines, as you know, there's a million of them now, but toxicology is one of those subdisciplines, of course, and that's the study of adverse effects that chemical, biological, and physical agents have on biological systems. Now, there are lots of different kinds of toxicologists. There are forensic toxicologists. There are human toxicologists that deal, obviously, with more medical issues. But if you choose to study toxicology more at the system, community, ecosystem level, then you get into this branch of ecotoxicology, and that's where I found my home. And as Dr. Amy said, our constructed wetland project allowed me to learn some tools of ecotoxicology that really set the course for me personally. So just a quick description of what that means. What's ecotoxicology, and specifically in this case, aquatic ecotoxicology? Well, it's using sentinel organisms that represent other critters out there, whether it be a feeding guild or some level of the ecosystem, and exposing those animals or plants, in some cases algae, and others, exposing those organisms in controlled environments in the laboratory or in a mesocosm, in some cases in the field where you have less control, obviously. But you're making decisions about the impact of generally a chemical stressor. As I said, it can be physical or biological, to that population of test organisms or sentinel organisms. Now today, so you know, back when I was here, I did a lot of this at the microscope, counting organisms that we had exposed to chemicals in the laboratory. Today, there are a lot more advanced molecular DNA-based techniques that are pretty fascinating. What that does is preclude, in some cases, the necessity to expose a whole organism or a population of organisms, and you can do it more at the molecular level. But we can, and I'm happy to talk about that more if you're interested. But let me give an example of what we do with those kinds of data. Well, when I was a student here, Dr. Amy advised that I get a book called Aquatic Toxicology by a guy named Gary Rand, and I studied that book fairly diligently. And we did things like this concentration response curve, and basically what this represents is the percent response is the response of your population, your test population in the laboratory. And if I expose them, let's say, for example, to copper in water, and so at the point that 20% or 25% of that population is beginning to respond adversely to the copper, I can draw a line over here to that concentration of copper, and I can get what's called an effects concentration of 25% of the population. Or I can look at the effects concentration of 50% of the population, and so on. So that's a concentration response curve. If you do this for a number of organisms, then you can do something like this, and that's called a species sensitivity distribution. And so you're basically taking these data for different animals and plants, plotting them on on a response and concentration level. And what do we do with that? Well, for example, if you need to set an aquatic life criterion or a water quality criterion that the state needs to do, Division of Water. Well, if you've got this kind of information, if you set that aquatic life protection level somewhere down here, you can bet that you're going to be protective of most everything else out there, right? So that's the concept. It's all about exposure and response. So now I'm going to give you a couple of examples or applications where this kind of a foundation in ecotoxicology has taken me. As Dr. Ramey said, I spent a couple of years in the risk assessment branch at Kentucky DEP, and there worked on ecological risk assessments. And that's a process of evaluating how likely it is that the environment might be impacted by various stressors, and generally chemical stressors, but you can use the same application for others. And I'll give you an example here of coal ash. Now, I'm still working on risk assessments related to coal ash. I've been doing it for about 10 years, and it isn't slowing down because there's lots of these out there and lots of problems to address. But I want to take just a second and run through what you see here on the screen. So the power plants back there in the background, these are usually they're located, well, always probably located on a body of water because they need to bring in water to produce steam. The steam turns the turbines, and that produces the electricity that goes out to our houses. And in that process, to create that steam, obviously they're burning coal. So generally they'll train car in coal or bring it in on barges on a river, offload it. You see the coal pile right up there. When the coal burns, it produces ash, just like wood ash. And coal ash it retains a lot of the natural metals that are in the coal to begin with, but now they're in a more concentrated form. So what they do with the ash is and this is the ash handling area. They'll truck it out here, and that's a very dirty process, as you might guess, because there's ash flying everywhere. It's being deposited, in this whole general vicinity. But anyway, they get it out here and they start to mix it with water. They form a slurry, or what's it called? They sluice it. So it's a slurry of ash and water, and they pipe that stuff out to a big lake or basin that looks like this, and it fills with water. And so you don't see the ash anymore, but it's deposited under the surface water. Now water's heavy, as we know, and so it's under a great deal of pressure. And these were created back decades ago, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And we've been doing the same process of managing ash since. And so what results is what we're dealing with now is groundwater contamination. The metals that I mentioned that are in the coal ash have now leached into groundwater, and that groundwater is now potentially impacting surface water bodies that are surrounding it. So a few years ago, if you ever remember or heard about the Kingston, Tennessee ash spill that happened at a TVA plant, resulted in something like this, where miles of the Clinch River were inundated with ash, as well as unfortunately homes and farms and so forth. Well, that set off a whole process of federal regulations related to coal ash, and called the CCR rule, coal combustion residual, not Creedence Clearwater Revival. And so I've been working on some of these risk challenges related to coal ash, not specifically this spill, but as I said, at plants where you have more of the unseen contamination coming from the basins. How do you do an ecological risk assessment? Well, it starts with this. This is called a conceptual exposure model. And basically, if you work your way from left to right, you start with the coal ash and you define how the constituents in the coal ash, those metals essentially, are making its way through what are called exposure pathways to your receptors. And our receptors over here, I've got some aquatic receptors, I've got some terrestrial receptors. I've chosen animals that represent different feeding guilds in the food web. And so what happens then is you model the dose that those animals are receiving through their diet and their ingestion of water and their direct contact with the soil and any other ways. But those are the primary ways. But it's a series of algorithms basically that calculates that dose. And then that dose that's in the animal gets compared to what's called a toxicity reference value, which goes back to those laboratory experiments I showed you about, where you establish a concentration that's safe for the organism or not safe for the organism, and you compare that concentration to the dose, and that tells you what's at risk and what isn't. What do you do with that? Well, you use that information to determine where cleanup needs to happen and where it doesn't need to happen. And so it allows the regulatory agencies to direct remediation and reclamation from that point. So that's kind of how it all fits together in the risk assessment perspective. There's an example of a cleanup of a coal ash site. This is down at the Savannah River site in South Carolina. Engineers like things very trim and rectangular. Hopefully someday it'll look like a forest area around that. All right, I want to show you another application real quick. And this is called Natural Resource Damages Assessment, NRDA. And I had the opportunity to work on the Deepwater Horizon spill as part of the toxicology working group on the NRDA. And that was a very collaborative process between consultants that worked for the federal government, consultants that worked for BP, and for what are called the trustees. When an NRDA happens, I'll get into that in a second, trustees are established. In other words, the representatives of the federal government that are going to oversee this process. And the difference between ecological risk assessment and NRDA is that NRDA is really focused on restoring ecosystem services to what they were prior to a spill. So there is some overlap with risk assessment, but again, there's a lot more elements of natural resources economics, of modeling where a chemical, in this case the Macondo oil, where it went, and then certainly where ecotoxicology comes in. What are the effects? What are the effects on the organisms in the Gulf? What are the future effects? How is it going to affect? How is exposure to the oil going to affect populations? For example, shrimp populations. How long is it going to take the shrimp population and the many different species of shrimp out there to reach their sort of baseline conditions, in other words, conditions prior to the spill. Here's a slide that kind of shows you that process. So the spill occurs, and you go into this pre-assessment where you establish what baseline is. You try to collect samples out there of water and sediment and plants and animals and data and establish that baseline. And then you get into this assessment part and the restoration planning part. And that's the part that I mainly was involved in. And then based on those data, like I said, the government, the trustees, and the responsible party share all those data, and they either agree of what the damages are and what the restoration should be, or if they don't agree, it goes into litigation, and the Department of Justice then just decides it from there, and that's how it works. And then you go into the restoration. So I'm going to show you, show you a quick example of that process. So I show you this slide, don't try to read this, please. But when we took a first cut at designing some laboratory experiments to address some of the immediate injury and then some of the longer term or what's called chronic injury, we were working with a number of organisms. I'm not a marine toxicologist, but it turns out I didn't have to be. As long as I understand, that exposure and response principle of ecotoxicology, it was applicable. So this was the first cut at our program that we did this collaboratively with the trustees. Just a quick side story. I mentioned a textbook by Gary Rand. Gary was one of the lead academic laboratory supporters of this program. So I got to design this program with Gary and another, incidentally, a guy named Bill Stubblefield. If you remember Bill, Bill's an expert in what's called photo-enhanced toxicity from polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs that are in petroleum. And it turns out that when you have a surface film of oil on water, and that's hit by certain wavelengths of radiation, it enhances the toxicity of those compounds. And we needed to certainly know that as part of this damages assessment. And when I met Bill, we were talking about his involvement, getting involved in this program, and we were having dinner, and I said, "So where'd you go to college?" And he said, "Eastern Kentucky University." And I said, "No kidding." No. So wound up working with Bill for this took up about 3 years of my life, working with Bill at Oregon State, working with Gary Rand at Florida International University, and a number of other laboratories around the country. So I'll show you real quick an application of ecotoxicology that we used in the damages assessment or the injury assessment. This was using Leptochirus plumulosus. It's a polychaete. It's a marine worm, lives in the surface sediment. And we were going to collect samples around the wellhead that ruptured, and to get an idea of the injury in the immediate vicinity of the wellhead. And we also collected samples, of course, to analyze for the chemicals associated with the oil. So here's how that looked. So here we are, Gulf of Mexico. The black star there is the wellhead. The white boxes represent the sampling locations. They ranged out from, out to 140 or so kilometers, but mainly clustered around the wellhead. So I'll zoom in a little bit there. As I said, clustered around the wellhead. These blobs and things you see, that's not oil. Those are geologic features on the Gulf floor. All right, now turn on some colors here. So the red circles represent where we saw mortality in the test organisms, in the polychaete worms. The green represents where we did not. So zoom in a little bit more. Right here, clustered around the wellhead, that's where we saw most of the mortality, within about 2 kilometers. And then you work your way outside of that, and you don't see the effects on the organisms outside that, roughly 2 to 3 kilometer zone. And I'll turn on, and so in the chemical concentrations, that's TPAH, that's the total petroleum. Total PAH is total polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So the chemical data match up really nicely with the toxicity data. You see your highest concentrations of the oil where you saw the mortality of the test organisms, and so on. You see your lower concentrations where you have your better survival of the animals. So what this do? So this helped determine that as part of this injury assessment, as far as the seafloor was concerned, most of the impact was in this 2 to 3 kilometer zone based on this test. That's just one. There were a number of studies to assess the injury on the seafloor, but this was one of them that was I thought pretty telling and turned out to be informative. So just going back, this is again that study was part of this assessment plan, and then you go into the restoration. Now, when I said the toxicity technical working group, there were technical working groups for everything, for pelagic fishes, for marine mammals, for shoreline birds, for shoreline vegetation. So all of this kind of comes together to work its way into a restoration plan. Okay. So this is my take a breath slide. I ran through a couple of examples there of how ecotoxicology, I've been fortunate enough to apply that in my career. What have I learned along the way? Well, I think there are a number of things that I can share with you. One is communication. I think written and verbal communication has kind of risen to the top of importance. And so I would urge you to if you have the opportunity to start, if you're writing your thesis now, for example, or you're writing research papers, really to take that seriously, take advantage of assistance that you might have either from a professor or a writing tutor if you need it, but because being able to write in the science profession is going to be critical. So I'll share that with you. Responsiveness, that's another one I've learned is I was going to say organization and time management, but I don't know, everybody struggles with that. I still struggle with that. But responding to folks that need your help is also critical. And I'm not saying that you have to respond immediately, but if someone emails you with a request, try to get back to them in a reasonable amount of time, because otherwise we're in a day and time now where obviously we're sharing information real time with our phones and whatnot. And it's especially important, I think, that in consulting, because people are hiring you to help them, right? And so responding, being responsive to your clients is an important thing. Can anybody guess where this is? It's in Kentucky. Yeah, nice. How'd you know? All right. Well, I grew up on the Green River, and that really is what formed me to come here to EKU and pursue biological sciences. So I'm happy to be close by again. I've spent a few days on it since I've been back. So now I'm going to shift gears and tell you a little bit more about present day. As Dr. Ramey said, I'm at Copperhead Environmental now, just down the road, and we have time for just a few minutes to wrap up here. Yeah, so I don't know, four or so years ago, I was having a beer with a guy named Greg Jennings, and Greg is a now professor emeritus from North Carolina State University, and he's a stream restoration guy. And Greg and I were talking, and he said, I know a guy named Mark Gumbert that you should meet. He's got a firm in Kentucky, and I think you guys would hit it off. And I just sort of filed that away. And a few months later, I was here in Kentucky at the governor's environmental conference, and I walked into the big room there where all the booths and tables and things are, and I see Copperhead, and I said, oh yeah, I remember Greg mentioning that. And I walked over, and there's Mark Gumbert, and I introduced myself, and I said, I'm supposed to meet you. and Mark and I started, I think we went out and had dinner that night maybe, but we got to know each other and stayed in touch over the next few years. And then last year, I was talking with Mark about making a change. I was ready to get back towards Kentucky and do some other things. I guess I was at a point in my career where my interest in ecotoxicology were taking me more and more in the direction of conservation and restoration. And it turned out that was a good fit with Copperhead. And Mark and I were talking, and he said, if I need to carve out a spot for you here, let me know. Well, I thought about that for a while and called him back, and luckily we continued that conversation. So I've been at Copperhead just about a year now, doing a variety of things, helping with mentorship of some of our younger staff in their professional development. I'm helping with strategic planning and where Copperhead is going to go in the future, and just having a really good time at all those things, as well as ecotoxicology. Like I said, I'm still working on coal ash issues. I'm working on some algal toxin challenges in drinking water reservoirs. Came about that sort of in a roundabout way. My graduate work at Clemson was on copper toxicity in fish and invertebrates and wetlands, constructed wetlands. And it turns out that algicides that are used in drinking water reservoirs are copper-based. Copper is what is the toxic element in those chemicals to kill the algae. Well, if you overuse those chemicals, you end up with a fish kill. Nobody wants a fish kill. It's happened, certainly. And so I'm helping some utilities manage their applications so that they don't end up in that fish kill area. So funny how those work out. But Copperhead, if you'd like to learn more about Copperhead, I'd love to tell you about it or come down to Paint Lick and show you around. We're strictly an ecological focused firm, no engineers, which is pretty awesome. No, I've worked with engineers my whole career and enjoy that. It's been a very collaborative, career for me. But this is the first time that I've worked at a firm where the focus was solely ecological and biological services. So really enjoying that. That's all I have. And unless you have questions about consulting or whatever, I'm happy to entertain them.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes.
Yeah, I have one. I know earlier on in the presentation, you talked a little bit about like the areas where the coal is and the power plants and how you keep track of all the effects of where all the multiple routes of where everything is going.
Right.
Do you maintain and record those things for like multiple areas like that or multiple like corporations?
You mean outside of the coal industry? Other industries?
Just like several areas. You conduct like research and several areas like different places.
Yes.
Like that.
Yes. Yeah.
And where are those?
Geographically and industry wise, it's got a lot of different applications. So the coal ash work that I'm doing primarily is in North Carolina and South Carolina, but Kentucky is having some of the same issues. Really, anybody that burns coal are currently under what as I said, the CCR rule, and having to adhere to those cleanup processes now. Yes.
So part of the NRDA, how often do you like complete step 3, like restore? Like how often do you actually reach like where you were like this place is restored and we no longer
That's
keep monitoring?
That's a great question. I don't know that you can point to one and say it's completely restored. I think there are examples. We could say maybe the Exxon Valdez. The Exxon Valdez is actually what started the NRDA process. I think the government realized that we didn't really have a process in place for something of this magnitude, and we need to. And so that helped shape, I think, the Oil Pollution Act, and NRDA was sort of born out of that. And so there's one that you could point to where you could have, I think, specific examples of at least rehabilitation. I don't know about full restoration yet, but it's a long, as you might guess, a long process. So that's yeah, great question. Yes.
So in the process of restoring the access, a lack of informed behavior approach, like for example, when you were talking about getting the shrimp back to the baseline, you
Mhm.
don't have any data on what the baseline is. How would you approach that?
It through modeling, through theoretical modeling. Yeah, or you can try to look at if you don't have the data for example, if you didn't have the data for the Gulf of Mexico, you might be able to take data from other areas that where shrimping, is part of the economy, for example, and you might have those data through a state regulatory agency or NOAA, federal agency, and apply those, to that situation. Yeah.
Can you go back to your brain slide when you were showing their mortality?
Yeah. I think if I don't have to get Luke back up here to help. This one?
You said, yeah, you said it was in like 2 kilometers.
Yeah.
So down here at 9 kilometers.
Yeah.
I was wondering what were, like, since it was so close to the well, what caused that?
That's a good question. It turns out that BP was drilling for oil here because they knew there was oil here, right? Well, the Gulf of Mexico is gridded off into plots, and there's a lot of research, obviously, that goes on about where to drill for oil, and not only are you drilling for oil, there are natural oil seeps all over the Gulf of Mexico. Turns out there was one in this area, or actually there are natural seeps around here, but this one was an old wellhead that had been closed and capped, and there was around the vicinity of that wellhead was what they call drilling mud. It's basically a mixture of oil and mud and whatnot that gets kind of deposited around that area. So it was speculated that was from that mortality, or that effect was from the drilling mud from another well. In fact, there was forensic work on that oil that showed that it had a different fingerprint than the Macondo oil. Yeah. Yes.
While you're on the slide, so what, right around the wellhead, where it ruptured, it was just, the oil was just settling out.
Yeah.
Out to 2 kilometers, and
Right.
beyond that, it was just getting caught in kind of the water movements and moving.
Yes.
Up to, because it's gonna rise to the surface, right?
That-
Why is some of it settling out?
Yeah, the majority of the oil, like you said, this is a very small fraction. This was focused on what's around the wellhead in that, that benthic impact right around the wellhead. But the majority of the oil, like you said, if it goes to the surface, and it would stay on the surface, but the response from the Coast Guard and others is to disperse the oil. So they were flying, C-130s and things, dropping what's called dispersant, which is, think about Dawn liquid detergent. It's same kind of formulation to break up the oil into droplets, and that caused then those droplets to sink. And most of the oil were in these masses of oil that moved with the currents beneath the surface. That's where most of the oil went. And some made it ashore, of course, some stayed on the surface, but eventually it disappeared, and it was in those water column masses where most of the injury occurred to pelagic fishes and mammals. Yeah.
He sold it, was focused more on kind of species of economic value than your work was academic.
Not so much. Not so much. Yeah, I think that was the case with Deepwater Horizon, certainly, because it was based around the injury to those economically valuable primarily species. But then there's the injury goes beyond that, where you're calculating ecosystem services, and all of it turns into a monetary fine for the responsible party. But back to your question, not necessarily. It's really about what organisms, populations represent that ecosystem that's been damaged, whether they're quote unquote valuable to the public or not. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
You're making these assessments, you see an account where like that may happen when like say file an application or
Yes. Yeah, the injury model that I mentioned are quite complex and take into account those future or chronic effects in the populations and future populations.
I noticed on your dose response curve, I believe there was like 3 points, and kind of classic points. This is dating myself a little bit, but I was around when EPA had went to a single data point to try and calculate that. Is that still being used, or?
If you mean pardon?
The EC.
The EC50, yeah, and the effects concentration used to be emphasis was put on the lethal concentration, the LC50. So we've gotten more conservative and set standards around an effects concentration, which is usually based on reproduction or growth.
Thank you very much.
Quite welcome. Thank you all.